The party has shifted very far to the right. I've decided to be a candidate for re-election in 2010 in the Democratic primary.
And with Senator Specter's defection, then there were two moderate Republicans left in the United States Senate. Senators Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, both women, both from the state of Maine. The state of Maine where Obama beat John McCain by 18 points last year, and where a January Gallup tracking poll found that 53% of Mainers are Democrats or leaning Democrat, compared with only 33% who say they are Republican or leaning Republican. The moderate Maine senator's reaction to the loss of their colleague today? Well, Senator Collins said that she is, quote, extremely surprised and disappointed with his decision to leave the Republican Party. On the other hand, Senator Snowe says she is disappointed with her party, telling CNN, quote, I've always been concerned about the Republican Party nationally, about their exclusionary policies toward moderate Republicans. Wait. Their exclusionary policies toward moderate Republicans? Their? I don't want to get too precious here, but don't you usually say our when you're talking about a group of which you think of yourself as a member? With one moderate senator driven across the aisle by what he called the radicalization of the Republican Party, what will happen to the remaining pair of moderates left in Maine? Joining us now is Nate Silver of 538.com. Nate, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
What kinds of factors do you look at to figure out the odds that we could see Senators Snowe and Collins follow Specter's lead?
Well, I assume the first thing every senator thinks about is getting reelected. The Republicans in Maine aren't quite the same as the ones in Pennsylvania. You don't have that kind of Pennsylvania part where you have a lot of evangelicals and you have very conservative Catholics. Instead, it's more a backwoodsy kind of New Hampshire libertarian thing. They tend to be reasonably happy within the Republican Party with Collins and Snowe. So they would not have to move for survival like Specter did. They might move parties because they just don't get along with the Senate Republicans anymore. That'd be something different.
Is there something that Democrats could conceivably offer them if they're ideologically close enough to be tempted? Is there something that Democrats could offer them that might make it attractive enough in terms of what they'd be able to bring home to the state?
Well, you have the usual trading chips as far as committee chairmanships, as far as support in a primary and so forth, but they also don't have to be that worried about losing to a Democrat. I think Susan Collins last year won her race by 14 or 15 points against Tom Allen, who was a pretty strong Democratic candidate. They're very popular up there. They are really exceptions, but they're already practically independents. I mean, I think we'll see this year, actually, Collins and Snowe vote with Obama more often than, say, a Ben Nelson in Nebraska. You might actually have that crossover, which you haven't had in a few years.
Nate, after the Republicans got control of the House in 1994, within a year it was 5 House Democrats, 2 Senate Democrats who all switched over to the Republican Party. Is it possible that, with that history in mind, that Senator Specter is the beginning of a party shuffle here, that Republicans who are at all inclined toward the center will feel a great incentive to jump over to the Democratic Party just so they can have some power?
Well, it's kind of a trick question because there aren't very many moderate senators and representatives, as you indicated at the top of the segment. Except for Collins and Snowe, you have people like George Voinovich, who's maybe a moderate but is retiring anyway, people like Chuck Hagel, who retired last year. This contrasts with the mid-'90s, where you had a lot of Southern Democrats, where the Democratic Party was very different in the South than it had been in the 60s and 70s. You had some long overdue, I think, party switches. So I think it'll more likely just be Specter, maybe 1 or 2 in the House, but I don't think we'll see a big groundswell here. They've lost those seats electorally without people actually having to switch.
Nate, you mentioned earlier about what you thought could happen in terms of Specter's voting pattern. I know at 538.com today you wrote about how history suggests statistically Specter might end up voting. How do you think? How far do you think he'll go if he does shift toward a more Democratic voting pattern, and how soon would we see it?
Well, I think it's kind of a cliche, but you might see kind of a Joe Lieberman type of Democrat who is certainly in the more conservative half of his party, but wouldn't be quite as conservative as Ben Nelson. He still will face some pressure from the left. The blogs are skeptical. The unions, after his deciding not to vote for the Employee Free Choice Act, are pretty skeptical. So he has to kind of tap dance here very carefully. I think he doesn't want to flip-flop right out of the box on EFCA after having flip-flopped on it before. But I think certainly if he doesn't support with some kind of gusto health care and cap and trade, the core elements of the agenda, he could find himself in almost as much trouble with the left as he already was in with Pat Toomey on the right.
Nate, thinking about what happens next to the Republican Party, and there was such a vivid denunciation of the Republican Party strategy right now from Senator Specter today. You've described what they're in right now post-election as a death spiral. How does that work, and how do they get out of that?
Well, I think they probably need a leader, quote unquote. Lindsey Graham was at an event in Washington, D.C. where I attended last night, and he was asked, who is the leader of the Republican Party? And he said, well, it's whoever we nominate in 2012. To go without a leader and to have a power vacuum for 3 or 4 years is really tough when everyone's kind of jockeying for position. I don't know. I think they need to find a way to kind of reconcile the kind of libertarian side of the party with more of the Sarah Palin social conservative side of the party in a way that seems somehow fresh and new. It's a very difficult problem. I think in some ways they're going to have their best hands handed to them by mistakes Obama might make down the road if the economy doesn't recover. But if the economy does recover, it's not going to matter. They haven't played that side of the argument very well, and they're going to lose probably even more seats, certainly in the Senate, maybe not in the House, where the picture's a little bit better for them. But they're not in good shape in the long term here.
Nate Silver of 538.com. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Nate.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.